So I have a problem with matchup charts. Now, it's not a huge problem, but I think they very easily could be improved to have much more relevant information that's more useful to everyone, which is why I'm proposing a different type of matchup chart. Now, current matchup charts are not horrible by themselves, and they do a good job of giving players insights on matchups with their character, especially when the players explain their thought process behind it, but I noticed some flaws with them. So let's go all the way back to the definition of a matchup chart. Now, I really had trouble finding a concise definition that I liked, but the wiki lists it as a estimated performance of a particular character versus another in competitive matches if the two players are of equal skill. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but the definition leaves it relatively open to interpretation. Does it assume two players are playing their characters perfectly, or just playing normally? Does it include two players that are your run-of-the-mill tournament players that compete at locals, or are we just talking top players? Are we talking about in theory or in practice? Is it in the perspective of a person who's making the matchup chart, or just everyone? And what about matchup experience? They assume the matchup experience for two players is the same, but that seems like a big issue because a player that plays a lower or mid-tier character is almost always going to have more matchup experience against high tiers than they have against them. Now, I know I'm being nitpicky, but I don't think we've agreed as a community on exactly what it means, even though no one's really arguing about it or talking about it in general. So let's look at the outdated Melee matchup chart for a second. Now, obviously, charts change, and it even notes that Yoshi and Pikachu's are a bit off because of the rise of players like Axe and Amsa. But even with the changes, it can be pretty much agreed upon that Pikachu still loses most matchups against top tiers, and Yoshi's even worse. So how can a player like Amsa in Melee routinely win sets against top players in what's supposedly a horrible matchup? And how does this explain how Axe has not lost to a Marth in about 6 years, even though Axe believes it's about an even matchup? Well, according to the chart, that either means Amsa and Axe are by far the best players in the world, or once top players get a hold of the matchup, they're going to start losing. And I don't think either of these are fully true, so clearly there's something wrong with how we view matchup charts in general, which is why I propose a chart that fixes a lot of our problems because it's not based on equal skill level, but on equal results, which I think is a lot more practical. So what does an equal results-based tier list look like? Well, surprisingly different. It assumes two players get about equal results and says how their characters should do against each other. Now, you might think this is extremely similar to our current matchup charts, but it's actually not. A big problem with matchup charts are that they end up looking very similar to a tier list. Characters that are top tier generally do good against most characters, and characters that are low tier generally do bad against most characters. And that's why they're top tier and bottom tier in the first place. But that doesn't really need to be factored in because it ends up causing some weird issues. Once we factor the tier placements out, we end up with a results-based tier list that we can use for two even-level players. So let's look at Void's matchup chart for a second for Pichu, and for simplicity, assume that everything on it is perfectly true. He has a couple losing, a few even, a lot of +1s, and a few +2s. Let's say Void is ranked 10th in the world. Let's also pretend that the 9th best player in the world plays Luigi, and the 11th best player plays King K. Rool. These are both +2 matchups for Pichu. Now, these three players get essentially even results, so how would number 9 and number 11 theoretically compare if they went head-to-head against Void? You might think that since they're both -2 matchups that they'll lose most of the time at about even rates. But that's not true at all. In this example, the King K. Rool player will actually go closer to Void than the Luigi player. And why is that? Well, think about it. Luigi is overall an average-ish character. Elegant says he's high tier, some people put him at mid tier, but let's just say he's around the 30th best character or so. That means he should have a matchup chart that averages out a little above 0, so he should have slightly more winning matchups than losing. And this does seem to be the case, or at least in Elegant's opinion. Now let's look at King K. Rool. He has a lot of losing matchups, he's generally viewed as a bottom 5 or 10 character, and it would probably average out to him having about a -1 matchup overall. So this means that if a player is able to achieve number 11 in the world with King K. Rool, they on average had to do this by playing characters that they had losing matchups against. So if King K. Rool has a -1 matchup against a top tier, then that means it should, in theory, be an even matchup for two players that get even results, since that's what their average matchup chart is. So for King K. Rool, a -2 matchup is not the same as a -2 matchup for a Luigi player. So on a results-based matchup chart for Pichu, since King K. Rool is used to a -1, you would generally just subtract 1 from his plus-minus, making it only a +1 for Pichu. However, since Luigi averages out to pretty even, you can probably leave him around +2. This is helpful because it actually shows how players should be doing against each other, rather than arbitrarily comparing skill level, which is impractical to measure and use. But you can measure results, which is why I think this is useful. So if you're still confused, here's another example. Kirby goes surprisingly even with Pichu. One of the best Kirbys in the world actually puts it as a +1. I think it's about even, maybe slightly towards Pichu's favor. But Kirby has a ton of losing matchups, and Pichu has a ton of winning matchups. So if a Kirby player gets similar results to a Pichu player, if they go to head-to-head, expect the Kirby to win most of the time, since the average matchup for Kirby is a -1 and the average matchup for Pichu is around a +1. But that doesn't necessarily mean Pichu loses all of his even matchups. Against another high-tier or top-tier character like Peach, who also averages a +1, you don't need to subtract anything, so it's even for both a results and skill level matchup chart. So to make a results-based matchup chart, you have to look at your character's average matchup, the other character's average matchup, and how they do against each other, and combine them all. So if your character averages a better matchup than your opponent, you move the other character down on your chart, and vice versa. Yeah, it's a little more work, but really all it comes down to is taking a normal matchup chart and shifting top tiers down a little and bottom tiers up a little to show how much better or worse your character does than you would expect. So I tried to explain this concept when I was making my Kirby matchup chart, but people generally just seemed confused by it and were just mad at me for saying how well Kirby does against top tiers. So I figured I would make a whole video on the concept, and matchup charts like these can explain why Axe can go undefeated against Marths for years, or how Duck Hunt dogs were able to beat top Diddy Kong players in Smash 4, or really how Komodo was able to hold his own against a player like Void. Now, it doesn't really change much when you're looking at top tiers compared to top tiers, but hopefully this can explain why some upsets between certain matchups are more common than others. A practical application of this is online play. GSP is simply put a results-based system, so you go against people who perform similarly to you. This can explain why people may often struggle with certain characters online, even if that character is not really present in the meta. If your character doesn't have a great kit to deal with Little Mac, even if it's a winning matchup on a normal chart, you might find yourself losing pretty consistently. A results-based matchup chart can show this and explain it much better. So hopefully all of this made sense, and I hope to see some players at least consider things like this when they're making their matchup charts. Usually players give their reasoning behind certain matchups, but I see too often that top players just release matchup charts without really explaining them. I really hope that I made sense, and I really hope that you guys can understand why I think it's important. If you disagree, let me know, and let me know why you think that way. I think these types of charts can be released supplementally with normal charts to give two different insights. I now feel comfortable finishing my Kirby matchup chart, since if you have any questions, I can direct you just to this video. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot that you stuck through this whole video, or maybe just skip to the end. Either way, I hope you can at least consider this idea and maybe try implementing it yourself. Thank you again for watching. Peace.